Welcome to the shop, my friends. Steve here at SKS Props, and with the remake of Dead Space soon to come out, I thought it'd be a really cool opportunity to go back and look at one of the very first costumes I'd ever created. This is back in December of 2013. I started the journey of building Isaac's Level 3 suit from the survival horror game Dead Space. By far one of my all-time favorite games. It is absolutely fantastic, especially if you're playing at night, in the dark. All of the sound and environment that's in this game is just, you have to experience it for yourself. Now, before you get too excited, no, I do not have templates for this. This is way back, I said, in 2013. Back then, a lot of the YouTube creators that do all of the tutorials and the templates and all that kind of stuff, we didn't do that back then. Back then, we had forums that we would post on. So I took tons and tons of pictures of the build process of Isaac's suit. And you can still find those on the Replica Prop forum and on the Instructables websites. The links to these, of course, are over on my website, and you can go check that out. Now, when it comes to building these types of things, this is before foam, really. This is back when everything I did was hand sculpted, molded, resin cast. There's a lot of thermoplastics that I heat melted and formed to get everything just the way I wanted. So that's also why almost everything in this costume is a one of one. The only thing that I made a mold for was the helmet itself, which was originally hand sculpted out of monster clay, molded and then resin cast. But it's back when I was a very much a newbie to prop and costume fabrication. So that mold really only worked like one or two times before I had issues with it. It's not like if I was to make a mold nowadays, it would survive more than one or two pulls. Now, when it comes to this build, it's a labor of love, right? When you're building a costume like this, especially from head to toe, all the details that are involved with it, you better love your subject material. So when it came to creating Isaac, just like a lot of my other builds, I had to locate my references. And of course you could go to Google, but it's not near as extensive as it is nowadays. So what I did is I went back and I played the game until I got to the point where I received my level 3 suit, and then was able to rotate the camera around, take a bunch of photos with an actual camera, upload those, and I had my collage just like I do nowadays in my shop. That allowed me to get some 3D perspective, at least to how everything goes together. Now, the biggest problem with that still is that it's still a video game that you're creating in the real world. So just like a lot of the other video games that are out there, I'm not going to name any names, from Soft, the head and everything is way out of proportion compared to the rest of the body, because you don't want it to have a giant bobblehead, right? So one of the very first things I decided I was going to do before I tackled the entire costume was, I've got to make sure that the helmet is exactly how I want it. I didn't want it too big. I didn't want that whole bobblehead look to it. And in fact, this helmet fits so well against my skull that every time I wore it, the front faceplate presses right up against my nose, and I would receive bruising on my nose because it's literally pressing it down to have that iconic look. But the small prices you pay to look awesome in armor, right? So like I said, when it comes to the helmet itself, all of this was hand sculpted out of monster clay. That was a very difficult process back then because we didn't have 3D printers. We did everything by hand, and I still prefer to do everything by hand, just because when you get down and you actually get to see all of the details that are in this, there are things that even 3D printers would have a hard time replicating, all the different tiny little pits and crevices that are sculpted into this. So I sculpted it and I made a junk mold. The junk mold is just there to get my first resin cast of the shell itself. And then from there, I'm able to do a Bondo and primer kind of mixture on top that I could sand to get the overall shape that I desired. From there, I could also add any additional styrene bits to the underside and to all these other pieces that are on top. That way I could then remold it, and all of this would then come out of the mold as one piece. Now, the only thing that didn't was this hose that ran across the back. That was all drilled through afterwards, and then the hose was placed internally. Now, when it comes to the faceplate itself, the faceplate was all cast separate. It was individual pieces for these face shields. They were all flat cast, and then before they actually cured, I would take them out, I would wrap them around a trash can, and I would clamp them into place so I got this nice subtle curve for the front of the mask. Now, the biggest problem with a helmet like this is the lights are right where your eyes are at. So I knew that it was going to be extremely difficult to see out of this thing. And it's actually extremely claustrophobic to wear because you can't hear all that well, you can't see all that well. But if you look, there is a slight gap right above this particular lens. And what that allows me to do is when I'm looking forward, I can kind of put the head down, I can see forward, and then for pictures, I would tilt it back and all of this would then be obscured. Now, this is again, back in the day, 2013, all of the front LEDs that are in this are all wired, and then it's ran to 2 battery packs on either side. The LEDs back then, we didn't have all the different options that we do nowadays, so I had to get some basic white LEDs and then hand paint them aqua to match the game. But it's one of those things that, like, cosplay back then, lights and smoke and like giant costumes and everything, you didn't see it every day. So when you saw costumes that had all that kind of stuff into it, it was a really cool experience. And even though I have made lots of different costumes between then and now, Isaac's helmet in particular is still one of my favorites just because it's so iconic and because at that point in time I was still extremely new to this hobby and I was learning so much from the experience. So after I completed the helmet, I started work on the rig, and the rig itself is all thermoplastics. It's all resin cast parts that are in here. Everything was scratch built because, silly me back then, that's how I thought Hollywood did everything. I didn't realize that, like, especially nowadays, if you have a lot of stunt stuff like this, you could make it easily out of foam, or you could do a build like this and then mold it and cast it and actually cast it out of like a rubber so that it just holds up a little bit better over time. But again, back then, didn't know that process. So all of this was heat formed out of styrene and Wonderflex, and all these individual pieces were cut. Now the problem with like the styrene and the Wonderflex and heat forming is that you pretty much get one chance. You can score it and you can snap it, but when it comes to these types of pieces that round over, you'll heat it up and you'll kind of bend it over either my thigh, or I'll have like a little jig that it had in there. And that way I could get all the pieces to actually curve with my back the way I wanted it to. Now, just like the helmet, I wanted the spine to light up as well, and same process as the helmet, the LEDs were all white, and then I was able to hand paint them this aqua color. I did throw some batteries into this, and it does still light up. It's kind of light in here, so it's hard to see. But like in a dark hallway or something, this turns out really well, and all the LEDs are under these little tiny bits that I have here, so you don't see any of it underneath all the different tubes. Now, when it comes to doing a lot of this type of work, you hear the references for like Greeblies back in the day, where like prop makers would go and they would get like model kits and they pull different things out to make things up. The biggest ones that I had issue with were these little knobs right here. And these knobs, I had tried to source knobs that are out there. So like back then I actually went to Radio Shack, which they had, but I couldn't find anything exactly how I liked. And so I was like, well, what does it look like? Like, what's the closest thing you can find and you can try to manipulate it? And I'm like, it looks like a Reese's peanut butter cup. And sure enough, like the size and everything was darn near perfect. And so I was able to locate one Reese's peanut butter cup in the house. I froze it, I molded it with silicone, and I resin cast it. And then I was able just to glue these washers on top just to give it that additional aesthetic to it. But yeah, that's one of my favorite parts of this particular costume, is just finding things that were around to use that really worked. But you would never think that it was a Reese's peanut butter cup until you point it out. And now every time you see that, or you see that knob in the game, you're gonna be like, that just looks like a Reese's peanut butter cup. So to go along with the costume, of course, you've got to have a weapon. And in this case, I decided to go with his iconic plasma cutter. And again, back then, we didn't have 3D printers, so all of this was scratch built. In this case, the back half of the gun was a Nerf gun, and that's because I wanted a good strong base for the handle itself to go into the rest of the gun. But all the front of it, all the rest of this was heat formed or cut styrene or Wonderflex or different bits of plastic to make this up. And it turned out really great. And of course, just like the helmet and the back rig, I wanted the front of the weapon to light up as well, so it still has the 3 iconic LEDs that you see in the front. Those are attached to an on-off switch and a battery pack. This whole front section actually lifts up and out of the gun in case I needed to change any of that or any of the wiring ever got messed up. So it's little things like that you think of, you know, it's like not just making the gun itself, but also figuring out, all right, how am I going to get all the batteries? How am I going to get it to light up? How am I going to get it to go together? And at the time, like, I was really, really proud of this. It's still really a nice weapon, but I decided that when I got my own foam line, I started the whole YouTube thing. I decided I had to go back and revisit the plasma cutter. And so this one is a lot more accurate than the original. All of it is foam, so it's extremely lightweight, but just like the other one, lights up in the front. All the lights and wires are ran through the foam down to a battery pack in the bottom. And for this one, there is a full video as well as a blueprint, so you can make your own plasma cutter. Now, for a lot of the arm armor and the chest armor itself, a lot of that was made out of foam, but it would still have a base of styrene or Wonderflex just to give it some support, and then I would cover it with either some 2mm craft foam, or back then I was using floor mats, and I was able to sand that down to give it this iconic look from the game itself. Same thing here. This was all Wonderflex and styrene, so it's plastic. This also does light up, and it would actually shine up onto his face. So if you've played the games, that's your map. That's how you're seeing. Again, in dark places where I had some really cool photos taken, this showed up great along with the helmet and the back rig. Now, most of these were, again, styrene or Wonderflex, but like the back half of this was like a Crayola pen that I had that was laying around. I'm like, all right, it matches that perfect. A lot of these were then just heat form styrene and then put foam over it for additional details. Just like a lot of the props that I do nowadays, it doesn't really matter what the base is. The paint job is what sells it in the end. At this point, Isaac was also my very first go at sewing parts for a costume, which I'm still not very good at that, but I can stumble through it okay. So with this, the sweater that's underneath was purchased from a thrift store, and then I was able to modify it and dye parts of it so that I could use the same material but get different looks out of it. All of this faux leather, though, was actually cut and patterned off of my body and then all sewn together. I'm not going to say it's the best, but I'm going to say that it's good enough for cosplay, because the soft parts along with all of the armor going together really give this an overall look that matches the game, and that's the main goal, right? It doesn't matter, again, if this isn't perfect. I didn't make it for a movie, and I didn't have a client for it. This was just my personal project. So I felt, and especially since it was one of my first costumes, I could have a little bit of leeway and still get it good enough without it having to be completely perfect. Now, when it came to all the soft parts, not only did I sew it for like the shoulders and the chest, I also did the pants and the boots. Unfortunately, all that stuff is still in storage and I can't get to it currently, but I will post some photos of it. You can see the jeans and how I wrapped that also in the faux leather. And then the boots were actually all foam for those. I used some floor mats, so they are gigantic, because you know, if you've played the game, you go around stomping on quite a bit of bad enemies. So you got to have big old boots to do that. Now, I'll remember when I did my very first test fittings for this and I started posting them online, I was extremely nervous because, again, not very many people had ever created this particular costume. It was, when you look at it, I mean, it's a very daunting situation. There are so many details that go into make it up, but that's why it's still one of my all-time favorites. When I did finally get around to posting them on the Replica Prop Forum and on my Facebook, people absolutely loved it. They thought it was amazing that I was able to capture so many things from the video game in this. Because again, remember back then, cosplay wasn't this intense. I mean, cosplay nowadays is everything is extremely detailed. Back then, it just wasn't that. It was a different era. And so to see something like this all put together with the lights, with the LEDs and everything, it was kind of like groundbreaking at that point in time. At this point, I was in a rush because I wanted to have it done for Planet Comic-Con in Kansas City. It was one of the first Comic-Cons where I actually had a booth, and I wanted to make sure that I had this on display, but regardless of that, I wanted to make sure that I was able to wear the costume and actually have some photos in it. I learned a lot since then, because when it comes to this particular costume, it took me about 20 minutes to get it on, and that is with the help of my loving wife. Since then, I have gotten very smart with my costumes, and I do a lot of quick releases and everything else. So most costumes I do nowadays, I can get in and out of in under like 5 minutes. That was not the case with this particular one. There's just so many layers, so many nuances that went into it that I literally had like a grouping of people around the booth watching this get put onto me. And because I was like, all right, I'm going to put it on at this time. And people showed up and then they had to just wait for me to get it on. But when it was on, it was awesome. So many people came up, got photos with it. And it was just a really cool experience. And again, it's one of those situations where at that point in time, cosplay just was not this intense. And so it kind of stepped up what I was wanting to do. And then it also, like, again, it helps inspire so many other people in the community because they see, oh man, well, he did that. And that's only his like second or third costume, or, you know, he hasn't been building all that long. I could probably attempt something like that as well. So at this point, I had lots of different offers from photographers that wanted to go out and shoot this costume. Obviously, it's really cool, and we had some cool locations set up. We actually went out to a haunted house in Kansas. We had some special effects artists, and we actually made a couple of necromorphs for the photo shoot. Now, the thing that sucked about that is that it was in the middle of summer, and at that point, there was no air conditioning in this haunted house, and in a full get-up like this, it was pretty awful. But the photos came out amazing, and I'm going to show you some of those here. So hopefully you all enjoyed a kind of look back and a retrospective of my Dead Space cosplay. Again, I'm sorry I don't have templates for this. It was way before that time, but hopefully this is inspirational to you. And if nothing else, you can build a plasma cutter. And then using a lot of my other videos, making your own templates, maybe this is a project that you can pick up later on. So thank you for watching this video. Hopefully it's inspirational, and I'll see you next time.